Hello and welcome to the CIPS Queensland podcast, where we interview Queensland professionals to get an insight to their careers, their highs, their lows, their wisdom and their advice. So let's check out today's podcast guest. In today's episode, I will be interviewing two of the CIPS Queensland committee members, Murray Watt and Dougalls. Let me just share a little bit about Murray Watt if you're not already familiar with him. He has been in procurement for years now, starting out as a head of procurement in the Queensland Government Treasury Department, then going over to contract management as an advisor. Murray has also been the chair of the CIPS Queensland Regional Committee for many years and is currently a managing director and principal consultant at Management Options, where he focuses on probity, advisory and audit, strategic procurement consulting, contract management and negotiations, as well as training facilitation. Let me just share a little bit about Dougalls if you're not already familiar with him. He has started his procurement journey in Coca-Cola Company, which led him into the Queensland sugar industry as a general manager for trading and risk, and now is currently a senior consultant at ArcBlue, specializing in supporting organizations with delivering positive change and creative value through procurement, the provision of training, consulting and advisory services, as well as delivering diagnostics, category management and strategy development, sourcing and saving strategies, social and sustainable procurement strategies. He has a lot of knowledge in this area and you'll hear this in today's podcast episode. Welcome back to the CIPS Queensland podcast today. Your host, Ashley Turner. I'm pretty sure you're all sick of my voice because I have been doing a fair few in 2022, but you've got me again. And today I'm actually interviewing two of our other CIPS Queensland committee members. We have Dougall and we have Murray with me today. Welcome, gents.
Thank you very much, Ash.
I love how quickly you said hello and, introduced yourself. Some people do that awkward pause and they're like, wait for each other. So thank you. We are going to jump straight into it today. And with the typical cliche question to kick it off is around how did you fall into procurement? So Murray, I'm going to pick on you first. How did you fall into procurement or choose procurement?
Well, this is an interesting journey, and I actually spent 25 years working in the Queensland Treasury, Queensland Government, and I started in finance. I was in the loan raisings program and the investment division early in the piece, and at some point around the late 1980s, I ended up as the administration manager for the Treasury, and I was responsible for a whole host of things, including writing ministerials, which was a very exciting but a great experience in learning how to write. And of course, the Treasury portfolio was extremely diverse as well, so that was a real learning experience. But as part of that role, in about 1990, the first ever statewide purchasing policy was released out to agencies. So most agencies, including the Treasury, didn't do any of its purchasing. That's what it was called back then. If we needed equipment, we would write a letter to the State Stores Board, and some months later, that item would turn up. And that was the same for a lot of agencies. And this policy landed on my desk, and I was given the task of implementing it. And so that's where my journey really started. So I ended up over the coming years moving from the administration manager into effectively the chief procurement officer, and was responsible for the whole portfolio of half a dozen different offices, including state revenue, casino control, superannuation office, and a few others. And so there's about 1,200 in that portfolio. And around about that time, the technology boom hit, and we went from buying pens and pencils to computers and computer systems and you name it. So it was a fantastic period. So that was my introduction to it, and I realised I had to learn about this. I attended every possible training course that was available from that point onwards, and brought myself up to speed so I knew what I was talking about, and that resulted in me going back and doing postgraduate studies in procurement management at Griffith University in the late 90s, and never regretted one hour of the many hours after work to do that over 2 years. But that was my introduction to it, and I must admit it was a massive decade of learning, but it was new to a lot of people. Moving and developing what was basically an administrative task of, I had one person writing purchase orders. Basically, that's what they were doing. And in the end, by the end of that, in 2002, I left the government to start my own consulting firm, and I had a team of 16. We covered procurement, we covered the major contracts. We also incorporated asset management and accounts payable into that team, and it was a great way to leave the organisation with all of those things in place. So that's me.
I love that you've had that. You've seen literally the evolution, evolving of procurement in Queensland. And I was sort of trying not to laugh when you said you got handed the policy. It was either going to be your greatest success or the biggest stitch up, but it was not a stitch up. You've transformed yourself and you've absolutely loved it, which I love that you do. And for anyone that does not know Murray, he is like our procurement Google. Like, he knows everything and everyone. So if you want to know anything, you hit him up, that's for sure. Dougal, what about you? How did you choose procurement or fall into it?
Yeah, I had a sort of similar experience to Murray in a way, but I sort of started out after university here in Brisbane, getting into the sugar industry, and was involved in the sales and marketing of sugar, which sounds really funny when you sort of hear about these sugar conferences, and people just can't believe that there's actually such a thing called a sugar conference. But there's obviously people around the world who trade sugar and buy and sell sugar, and Australia was the biggest raw sugar exporter back in the early 90s when I sort of jumped into working in the export area, and worked there for a number of years and as a sales and marketing sort of officer. And it was about the same time that Coca-Cola was putting together their global procurement team. And so this is when they were, I suppose, for the first time building categories and global categories. And I was lucky enough to sort of had known a couple of the Coca-Cola team members, and ended up becoming a global category manager for sugar at Coke, based over in the USA, which was a really interesting sort of first procurement role. So I sort of went into the procurement world not really knowing very much about procurement, but knowing a fair bit about my category, I suppose. So it was an interesting journey to learn the procurement process, and over about 15 years working with Coca-Cola, ended up moving into like chief procurement officer type roles, and covering all the different spend areas over those 15 odd years. So really interesting journey, and definitely come out with a very strong appreciation for the real value that procurement can provide to local communities, suppliers, and obviously to your customers, delighting customers as well.
I love that you didn't start off in some small company with procurement. You went to like one of the biggest global companies around the world to start off your procurement category, especially in sugar as well, because we all know Coca-Cola. That's a huge commodity right there for that. Jeez. Love that. What is my next sort of question, guys, is what is the biggest change that you have seen in the industry over the years? Because I know you've got a few notches on your belts over the years to see all the different industry changes and that. Murray, I'll go with you first. What's the number one biggest change that you've seen?
I think it's a combination of two things, and one is the professionalisation of our procurement profession. So given that a lot of people came to it, as you say, they fell into it, and learned along the way from others. Many of us took up the opportunity to take on further training and tertiary studies, etc., to add to that. So that's been part of it, and that's been a challenge for a lot of people. And I see that when you've got that the formal education with experience, that's where you're starting to get the mix. The other element to it that I've seen change dramatically has been the diversity in the profession. And the yardstick I use, if I go back in, say, to the 90s, attending procurement conferences, or back then it was most probably referred to as purchasing, there would be 95% of the crowd would be male, and there would be a few ladies in the crowd. And as we've moved forward, it's almost like this, you can see the shift where we've got it most probably around 50-50 now, or depending on what the subject matter is, that it is not male dominated any longer. So that whole diversity has just added to a whole range of aspects that go towards, you know, being successful in this. So that's been, I've particularly taken note of that, and had a bit of a smile on my face as I do my straw poll at every event that I attend, to see those numbers as they've progressed.
And you do see that even at the CIPS committee events, you'll see it's a 50-50 split, and you'll see all different ages. Everyone looks also different. We all have different sort of skill sets or niches in it, and it is very diverse, which is a great representation of the Queensland sort of profession in particular. What about you, Dougal? What is the biggest change you've seen?
Yeah, I think similar to what Murray was saying, I think it's the professionalisation of the function. Even recognising it to be a function, I think, is probably a big journey. And so I feel very lucky in a way that I was there right at the start when, you know, a company like Coca-Cola began, a global category model, and sort of built that out, and it eventually covered all the different spend categories. And I think that was part of a really good experience, because it obviously created a lot of value for the organisation and all the franchise bottlers around the world. But I think also part of that was also just seeing what working with your suppliers in a strategic way can do to enable value chains and sustainability initiatives and whatever is regarded to be a value driver. And seeing CEOs and presidents of organisations really starting to get excited about working with suppliers in a really strategic way. And we had a couple of opportunities where we started to look at 10-year time horizons as opposed to 2 or 3 year budget periods, and that really changed the dialogue a lot with your suppliers. You move from talking about contract negotiations or your usual sort of issues to starting to have very, very strategic investment related conversations and those sorts of things. So that was really interesting for me. And now that I'm sort of doing training, quite a lot of training these days, we usually reference organisations like Apple and others where the procurement and supply chain function really is a critical differentiator of some of these really big organisations these days. So I'm still very excited about that journey as a professional, because I think we're seeing it in the private sector working really well, and I think the public sector is starting to get some real value and looking at these really strategic initiatives. But there's still a hell of a lot more that we can do there, and as a taxpayer, that's something that actually interests me. And also seeing local procurement initiatives, local sustainability initiatives through being really enabled through procurement activities. They're the sort of barbecue conversations that I think we all like to have. So I think it's really, really great to see we've moved from the back office or the admin section, I think cutting purchase orders, to now having some really strategic discussions.
So you can hear that procurement is now sexy, guys. We've just heard that we are sexy. One key change that I think I've seen in my short years compared to you guys is procurement not just being a money sort of target. It's the more sort of commercial financial targets that we've got on our backs now, which I personally love, that more employee experience or customer experience type things, the quality, the velocity, the people over the dollars. And it's taken a long time for us to all get there. I know there's heaps of businesses and industries still struggling with that. We'll always be sort of dollar target hungry as procurement, but I love that it's more sort of balancing out now, that I've sort of seen in my sort of short years compared to these two guys combined. My next question for you guys is around essential skills. And you guys would have seen a lot of procurement people, really good rock stars. Some you're like, oh Lord, what are you doing at procurement? We've all met some of those as well. What do you think in your eyes is like a must-have skill and like nice to have skills? Murray, over to you.
Okay, yes, this is a good one. So I won't nominate initially, at least, which is the essential and which is the nice to have. But I see that people that want to be effective in procurement must develop an expert understanding of the procurement fundamentals, including an understanding of the law of contract, at least as it relates to the offer and acceptance process, those fundamentals. Without that, I think you're, traveling blind as to the one thing I learned when I studied this was that each time you speak to a supplier, there's the potential for you to be creating obligations and rights for the parties, and people are often surprised when they learn some of this stuff about the fundamentals of contract law, as to they can really be getting themselves and their organisation into difficult territory in the long run, because suppliers, if they feel like they're being misled or mistreated, that they can either not want to do business with your organisation because of that experience, So understanding that, what those fundamentals are, once you've got that, become that expert in the rules that apply in your organisation to how your organisation conducts its procurement, but become an even bigger expert in keeping those rules in the background. So firstly, develop the ability through the use of effective communication skills. So, and your interpersonal skills, to me, are at the top of the pile if we're talking about essential skills. So you've got to have those to be able to communicate with multiple stakeholders in a procurement. Sometimes you're dealing with one client, internal client, others you're dealing with a group of stakeholders, some of them for, some of them against, some you don't understand yet. So your ability to communicate both verbally and in writing with them is such an important part. So it's only when you understand the business objectives and the actual outcomes that they're looking for, can you guide them with your knowledge of those rules. So to me, there's two paths there, which I'll most probably mention again later, and that is you can join that group, and it's most probably the old guard that were very much rules based, and that's all they quoted. They found reasons to say, no, you can't do that, instead of, no, let me understand what you want to achieve and let me help you get there, and I'll guide you. And the need to state the rules becomes a very much underpinning, but unspoken in many cases, and you develop ongoing and sometimes long-term good relations with your customers, your internal customers. And so I see a combination of those being, if you get those right, it also tells me that you most probably learn a whole lot of other skills along the way because you're open to it.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I agree with those two. What about yourself, Dougal?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting when we think of ourselves as procurement, people. We deal with a lot of sales people, and I think that's one of the sort of things we when you do a bit of a mapping of skill sets for a good category manager or a good strategic procurement manager leader, they're exactly the same as a key account director or sales commercial leader on the sales side. And that shouldn't be a big surprise to all of us, but that strategic selling capability of selling ideas or selling yourself, I think is a really, really important piece of what we do. And I think, as Murray was just saying, I think the old days of being the rule sort of enforcers, that's sort of the old world of procurement. And I think, as a profession, we probably had a pretty bad reputation because, people were trying to do things and we were essentially saying no to a lot of that stuff. And that's, I suppose, one of my learnings in working with different, categories and spend areas where, procurement hasn't traditionally always been involved. That first sort of initial period of really understanding what the drivers were for that particular spend area. And it's not always value, it's not always dollars. And really working those through and getting it back to your corporate objectives or strategic objectives for that particular budget area. I found always really helpful to spend some time listening and going through those objectives really clearly up front, because otherwise we get caught in the weeds and just trying to sort of run a process which doesn't necessarily drive any value or provide any value to your stakeholders. So I think, to Murray's point, spend that time up front, really understanding the needs and engaging with your stakeholders requires really good communication skills. But I think, that tying it back to your objectives and what is the reason we're doing this procurement activity in the first place, and then really selling concepts and selling ideas, whether it's different alternative suppliers or different ways of doing things, de-speccing, looking at, should cost models, et cetera, to sort of really understand your category and working with your stakeholders and show them the value of data-driven activities. I think you could sort of look at all the basic stuff as pretty foundational, but it really comes to life with really good listening skills, engagement with your stakeholders, and understanding how the procurement activity supports what they're looking to do.
I think to add to that, it's simplifying the really technical stuff from like the engineers up to the board as well. It's trying to grab it all, and you're like this messenger in between to go, how do I articulate this in a way where all parties are going to understand? And you both sort of touched on it. You could be the most technical person in the room and know exactly what you're doing, all the policies, all the bloody pages and sections. But if you don't have that skill set for people to like you, or you to influence them or make them feel good or make them know that they can trust your word and stuff like that, you're not going to get anywhere. Because I remember when I first started procurement, I was like, number one, I have no idea what this is. I am Googling this, like, what is procurement? But number two, the manager went, we chose you because you're the best person with people and you adapt and you're like a little chameleon, Ashley. You can go talk to the fitters and be a little bogan in the workshops, and then you can, stand in front of like the board and articulate the same sort of message at the same time. Not many people can do that. So that communication style and listening or changing the way you approach things, like disc profile, I think we've all learned that sort of stuff really, really helps.
Yeah, look, absolutely, Ash. And if I could just chip in and say resourcefulness and flexibility is such an important couple of skills to have. And just really, I've always said that, but you prompted me in what you've just said there, that I've always sort of raised that in training courses I've used to do. If you can be resourceful and think outside the square and be flexible in that, you can get yourself not so much out of, but circumstances where it'll freeze you up to do stuff, to inform yourself, it's very, very good.
Very good. Good to be adaptable. Do not fear change, people. That's for sure. Especially in procurement, nothing goes the right way. I can tell you that. Well, I twitches all the time. Now, my next question for you guys is, what is the greatest lesson you have learned? One piece of that you have learned over the years. Dougal, I'm going to hit you first.
Yep, I think certainly it's not to lead with the process. I think, and so I think that's where procurement people, we trip ourselves up a little bit, and I've sort of experienced this in a couple of different ways over the years. But when we talk about our area, we usually talk categories. And we talk about spend and we talk about contracts and that sort of stuff. And I think when it comes to your stakeholders, that stuff's actually almost irrelevant. They want to know what's this activity, or what are these suppliers doing to help me with what I'm looking for. So I think bringing it back to the corporate objectives or your stakeholder objectives is probably the most important thing that I've learned. And had lots of battle scars over the years, and so that's one of the things I've learned is leading with that, and definitely not leading with the process, and really focusing on what your stakeholder requirements are and what you're actually even doing the procurement activity for is probably the most important thing. Because if we focus too much on the process is definitely important, don't get me wrong. We've got to make sure we're doing things legally and with probity and all that sort of stuff, and making sure we've got good contracts, to what Murray was saying earlier. But if we don't do that first part and really make sure we're really clear on why we're doing the activity in the first place, we certainly don't get the best results, that's for sure.
Yeah, 100%. Murray, how about you?
Yeah, look, just reinforcing that. And I say, look, never prejudge a client, a project, or a strategy. Be prepared to listen, most probably in proportion to, you've got 2 ears and 1 mouth, so that ratio is a fair gauge for that, to understand that, and then go about it with essentially those 3 key areas of research. Understand what the demand is, ask all the questions, what's the risk profile, how we're going to manage that, and do your market analysis before you start thinking about how we're actually going to go about the procurement strategy itself.
And something that sprung to mind when I was listening to that is when people, you'll have stakeholders that push back just because they've had a bad experience with a procurement person. And they'll say, this will never be done. Oh, you've always said this, rah, rah, rah. When you hear that, you just engage and go, yes, I'm going to prove you wrong. Let's do this. Like when you just have that full energy, they're like, oh my gosh, she's actually going to get this done. Like they just have this idea. You just want to change that perception even more. I think when someone resists, you go, let's go on. This is a challenge. I love this. Let's run at it.
Yeah, good approach.
So my next question was going to say best advice, but I'm actually going to flip that around because you've kind of given that with your greatest lessons, I think. What is the worst advice that you have received throughout your career? And Dougal's got this big smile on his face, so I'm going to ask him to share his first.
I think the worst advice, I think, would be probably building on what Murray was saying there. I think is thinking we're the experts. And so I think that there's so many suppliers out there that we can learn from. There's your stakeholders are usually very passionate about the area that they're in. So I think whenever you sort of hear procurement people saying that we are the experts, I think that's probably to be taken with a bit of a grain of salt. And we might be experts at certain things, but you can always learn more. And that was one of the things which always very quite passionate about was. Yeah, you might know things here in Australia quite well. You might know things across Asia quite well, but do you know it at a global level? Are you a global expert? So I think having that sort of almost restlessness to try and keep learning is probably one of those things there. So worst advice is thinking we're an expert.
I love that, and I've always said don't come in beating your chest. Like don't go in trying to prove your point, kind of thing. Just go. Be easy, just be chill, listen, take it all in. Murray, what's the worst advice that you have received?
Well, I'd like to flip that because nothing stands out, because a long time ago, I came to the realisation that you must take responsibility for your career and how you go about developing it, and don't rely on others. So I've had a lot of good advice. It's not widespread, but I guess I just focus on the stuff that it rings true for me, that it is good advice. You may not immediately take it. And through my career, certainly working for someone else. So I've worked now for my own self in my company for 20 years now. So there's 2 big parts to my career, but before I launched into that, I had made the decision that I was not going to rely on anyone else. Things changed dramatically, most probably in the 90s in particular. And so that's certainly the advice I give to younger people. Take responsibility for that. Keep learning. You never stop learning, and then move accordingly. And be prepared to move. So that whole adaptability and flexibility then comes into that, because if you're not careful, you find yourself painted into a corner that you feel like you've got no options. So to me, take that responsibility yourself and be prepared to make the moves, take a bit of risk, get out there, try and understand your value and go for it.
Yep.
And this is why Murray's so wise, guys. Listen to that.
I'd add to what Murray just said there too, Ash. I think that as a career, I think continuous learning is really a great objective, and just being happy to learn on the job. Like, don't expect to have formal training all the time. You can learn so much just from actually projects or working on things. So I'd say volunteering, being curious to learn more, whether it's about different categories or different ways of doing things or technology or other parts of what we do. It certainly helps us to become more rounded in terms of our overall knowledge.
I agree with you with all of that. My sort of final question for you guys is around sort of two parts. You can pick which one you want to talk to. It's around what are the sort of upcoming procurement trends or focuses for 2022. Murray,
Over to me. Yeah, look, again, I like to see it as the challenges perhaps of 2022, and I'm going to leave aside the challenges at a global level with the war in Ukraine, or should I say the invasion, and other things happening around the world. I'll set that aside because they're well canvassed, certainly in the media, in terms of the challenge to supply chains. But I think at a local level, I think the access to skilled procurement resources is a real challenge going forward, and I think we've got a fairly serious de-skilling that's happened, particularly in procurement, most visible in the public sector to me, and there's a lot of scrambling going on at the moment, which I think will go for the rest of 22 and perhaps beyond. But you don't get good outcomes when you haven't got skilled people, or you've got limited skilled people in the procurement profession. It's been disappointing to see that occur, but I think that we're right in the early stages of the effects of that. And so if you've got the experience and skills and you've taken responsibility for your career, you're most probably nicely positioned in relation to that, because you're going to be in demand. And for others in the early part of their career, take responsibility, learn as much as you can, and building on what Dougal said there, volunteer to sit and maybe be mentored by others in your network that will be happy to share those that knowledge and some experience with you. Build it as quickly as you can, and then put your hand up at the first opportunity to join a project or take on some extra tasks that you can learn from.
100%, and especially if you guys have not attended a CIPS Queensland event in particular, come along. Like, you've got, I think there's about 15 committee members, and then plus all the people that attend, all that years of experience in that room. You can definitely find yourself like a mentor. In the last event that we went to, I've picked up that I'm going to be a mentor for another lady that's just starting in her procurement sort of profession, and she wants to learn more about the soft skills and in people, and that's one of my biggest sort of strengths. So definitely come along, and you've got a wealth of knowledge right there at these events as well. Dougal, how about yourself?
Yeah, I think one of the big ones out there at the moment is almost like returning back to more local buying and local sourcing. I think we went through the phase of everything being offshored and going to low-cost country sourcing and all those sorts of activities and global sourcing. And I think, it's great to see things going back to roots and going back to local supply chains. And I think, obviously, the global supply chain challenges we've had over the last couple of years has really highlighted, the complexities of global supply chains. And I think, I'm actually quite excited about seeing what happens now in terms of rebuilding local supply in solutions, across a range of different industries here in Australia and in other countries too. I think that's going to lead to some really good sustainability outcomes, and I think it's also going to lead to hopefully more financial money obviously flowing back into the local economy, which I think is really exciting too. So being able to track that and see the progress, I think is really interesting. And it's obviously come from a big challenge, which is the supply chain risk, but I think it's actually a really positive development.
Love that. My sort of final thing I was going to do for you guys, I've just thought about it. Do you guys have a question for us as a group? I'll give you a chance to ask your question to the group.
Okay. To avoid that silent little patch there, I'll speak up. I guess continuing on with the theme I started with part the way through there, my challenge is to everyone, are you taking responsibility for your continuing learning, whether it's formal or informal? And if not, why not? And start your plans now. Don't wait till a circumstance presents itself that you can't take advantage of because you didn't do anything.
That's a good question. Dougal, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'd sort of challenge a similar vein. Challenge yourself if you've got a really difficult stakeholder that you're working with. I'd say, yeah, try. I think what Mario suggested before, that using your 2 ears and doing a bit more listening and really bringing it back around to your stakeholders' objectives, and just seeing if that can help in terms of looking for what you're working with your difficult stakeholders out there, because that's a really important skill for us all to learn as procurement professionals.
There we go. We have heard it today from Murray and Dougal with their sort of final questions for you guys. I'm sure there was a lot of golden nuggets throughout that. From all three of us have had such different journeys and experiences and that. So it's great to just get us all in the room and talk it all through. I wish I could do a podcast with everyone. That would be great, but that would probably take hours, especially with me and my talking abilities, that's for sure. But honestly, I want to say thank you so much, guys. I know that we are all under the pump at work with deadlines and stuff. So I do appreciate you guys taking the time out of your busy schedules to be a guest. I hope you enjoyed yourselves.
Thanks very much. Absolute pleasure, Ash.
Thanks, Ash. Really good fun.